You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Good Question Podcast. My guest today is Andrew Hipp. He's the director of the Herbarium and a senior scientist in plant systematics at the Morton Arboretum. So we're going to talk about his research and his work, with the plants, and it's going to be a very fascinating interview. So welcome, Andrew. Thank you.
And thank you for having me.
Yeah, tell me a bit about your background and what interested you in working in the Arboretum in the first place, and, a bit of the history.
You bet. So my background is I got into plants by a sort of circuitous route. I was interested in creative writing as an undergraduate, really excited about storytelling and narrative in general, but I also liked being outside. So I spent a lot of time outdoors in the course of, growing up and as an undergraduate, and started taking botany classes just as a vehicle to getting a job outdoors. I hadn't expected to study science, but as I got into plants, little by little, I got more and more excited about plant taxonomy, about the business of learning to identify plants, learn who they are. I found that as I identified plants, I would recognize them in more and more places, and this gave the places that I liked exploring, the forests, the prairies, every place that I was traveling. It gave these places a lot more rich.
That's really interesting. So what was it like? When did you notice that, and what was the realization like as you were on a hike, let's say?
Yeah, I was, I remember being, what age would it have been? I guess 21 when I took my first plant taxonomy course. And then I was camping in the driftless area of Wisconsin afterwards. And I was seeing wild ginger, and I was seeing intermediate fern and bloodroot and other plants that I learned that semester. And I was suddenly able to understand where habitats were shifting. Whereas before that, I had only seen the forest as kind of like a wash of green. So yeah, it was really that excitement about natural areas that got me interested in going back and then pursuing my PhD.
That's very cool. Okay, so keep going with the story.
After I finished up my undergraduate, I got a position as a ranger at the UW-Madison Arboretum, and I was doing natural history education, working with kids, working with adults, people from the ages of 4 to 94, and everybody sort of has this fascination with the natural world, that people are really drawn to it. But what I was finding was that the stories I wanted to understand, I didn't have enough knowledge to sort of work my way into. So after 4 years as a ranger, I went back and got my doctorate in botany, basically to understand the stories about how plants have evolved and how they're adapted to their environments. I wanted to understand this connection between evolution transpiring over the course of tens and hundreds of millions of years and ecology, this interaction of organisms over that time and in the forests where we live today. So I went back and got my PhD, really trying to understand and contribute to our understanding of the tree of life, the relationships amongst all organs.
Which kind of plants fascinate you the most nowadays? What is your research about?
Yeah, well, as far as what plants fascinate me the most, it's really hard to say. I love aquatic plants. I love trees. I love angiosperms that live on land. I love mosses. So it's very difficult to say which plants excite me the most. It sort of depends on who I'm looking at the time, which plants I'm looking at the time. But most of my research right now pertains to oaks and sedges. I do an awful lot of work on understanding how oaks have evolved. Oaks came into existence about 56 million years, sometime between 50 and 60 million years ago in the far north, and differentiated over the course of the last 50 million years to produce the roughly 425 species we know worldwide. They've covered much of the northern hemisphere, worked their way down to the equator, hopped into South America once, and have really, really produced such a huge amount of diversity and been a massively successful group. Oaks are among the most are the most diverse woody plant group of North America and Mexico, both in terms of number of species and also the most productive in terms of biomass. So they're an immensely important group.
Have oaks been cultured by people? Have they been bred selectively for certain properties?
Yeah, there are definitely a lot of oak cultivars out there, and people have been making use of oaks as long as people have been around. Modern humans would have first encountered oaks in abundance when our ancestors left Africa in 60,000 years ago and started migrating across Europe and East Asia and encountered tons of oak.
Well, again, what properties do they bred for, the past couple hundred years?
Yep. People utilize oaks for some of their obvious properties in terms of making wine barrels, making ships, making furniture. People have used oaks for their acorn. People have been eating acorns as long as they've been encountering oaks. And of course, for building our homes.
Okay. So what is your research about today in regards to oaks? What are you looking at?
My research pertains to the evolution of oak biodiversity. So what species there are in the world, understanding their taxonomy and their species limits, understanding how genes move between species by hybridization, and understanding how this interaction of genes among species and specialization to environments results in more and more species and shapes the tree of life. Then how the oak tree of life shapes the forests and the savannas where we live. So it's really about the interaction between evolutionary history and ecology, making the communities, the plant communities that we have come to know and love.
So what role do oaks have, in some of the places you've studied?
What role do they have? Well,
in the local environment, what role do they tend to take, in the ecosystem?
Yep. So oaks are extremely important for fungi, for insects. There are perhaps more caterpillars that depend on oaks in our local environments than on any other tree genus. There are hundreds of insect species, fungi that depend on oaks. Oaks really shape the forest, they're foundation species. So by the fact that they produce so much biomass, right, just so much material, they give insects and as a consequence, birds and mammals a ton of resources to live off of. Then there's sheer number of species, the diversity that we find in the forests, from North America down through Central America, in Europe and East Asia. All that specialization, that chemical specialization, that ecological specialization gives a diversity of resources for different kinds of fungi, different kinds of insects to survive on. Now, that's just the leaves and the wood. When you count the acorns are depended on by weevils, by dozens of fungal species that will live inside the acorns, by moths, by ants. When an acorn falls off of a tree, it will often have a weevil larva inside of it, fall to the ground. That weevil larva eat for a while, devour some of the good food that's inside that acorn, and tunnel out the side. The little hole that's left in the side of the acorn becomes a portal, often for ants in the genus Temnothorax, who walk on in and make a second home out of that acorn, move their babies in and out through that hole up and down is to moderate their temperatures. And then as that acorn decomposes, it becomes food for the fungi that is picked up first in the canopy of the tree and then from the fallen leaves on the ground. So the acorns that don't even grow up into trees feed a huge number of organisms in the forest. So when you look at all these interactions rippling out from a single oak tree, each oak tree's effect on the forest is really, really high. And the sheer number of trees, both in terms of their stem count, the number of individuals, and in terms of their diversity, the number of species, is disproportionate to extremely high compared to other woody plant genera.
Well, what percentage of acorns go on to become new oak trees? Like 99.9% of them end up decaying, or what's the story?
I don't know what the actual number of them is, but when you think about it, each tree every year produces billions upon billions of pollen. These pollen grains may fly anywhere from, a meter before they smash into another tree and hit the ground. They may go 50 meters, they may go 100 meters. Sometimes they travel as far as 30 kilometers and still successfully reach an oak flower. So every spring, when you look up in the trees and see all these dangling catkins or aments, these are the male flowers. And each one of those catkins that you see in these little strings has dozens of flowers on it. And each one of those flowers has thousands of pollen grains inside it. The very, very, very small percentage of those pollen grains that fly through the air and successfully land on a female flower may tunnel down through, they'll send out a little pollen tube. That pollen tube will tunnel down through the styles, through the female flower, down to the ovule if it has a chance, right? So if it's successful. Now, you get on a single female flower, you can get dozens to scores of individual pollen grains, all producing pollen. They race on down, and at some point, if they're not compatible with that female flower because they're too distantly related or because they're from the same tree, the female flower will snuff out those pollen to stop them from growing. Still, after several weeks, several of them may make it down to the base of the style. That's the little stalk that holds up the stigmas at the end of the female flower. And then those pollen tubes will wait at the base of the style. They may wait for weeks if you're looking at a white oak. They will wait for a year or so if you're looking at a red oak. Then a few of those tubes will begin to grow again. And one of them will typically make it all the way to an ovule and fertilize that ovule. That ovule then is what becomes the baby plant and will grow into the acorn.
What's interesting or unique about the structure of an acorn versus other types of products from plants?
Yeah,
I don't know what you call the generic family of
that's great. That's a great question. It's a nut. It's a kind of a fruit, and the acorn is a fascinating fruit. Every acorn begins as a female flower with 6 ovules. Now, when the pollen tube gets in there, usually all but one of those ovules abort. So you just get a single seeded fruit. That is an acorn, right? Now the acorn, as that ovule swells, if you look at a little pistillate flower, a little female flower on a tree, it looks like a teeny tiny acorn first. As it begins to grow, nutrients and water are just pouring into that acorn. It swells up. What you're seeing happening inside that acorn shell is that the baby plant is beginning to absorb nutrients that the adult tree is passing along in the form of endosperm. Endosperm is just a sort of a nutritious juice that the female tree, that the tree makes for the acorn. The acorn absorbs this into a massive structure called the cotyledon. If you ever have broken open an acorn and seen it's like a massive white stuff in there, that white stuff they're 2 seedling leaves called the cotyledon, and they wrap around the baby plant. The baby plant there then is stuck at the very end of the acorn. So imagine an acorn. You've got an acorn in your hand. You got the cap at the top. The cap looks like a little hat. If you break off that cap, right, and you cut open the acorn wall there, the shell, you're looking at the end of the cotyledons where the baby plant is not growing. At the other end, at the pointy end, that's where the baby plant. Now, what's fascinating about the acorn is that the acorn holds all this energy that the parent tree has given to the seedling so that it can grow up. Now, this is great for the seedling, right? Because when the acorn lands, if it's taken by a squirrel and buried in the ground, it's taken by a wood jay, a blue jay, and buried in the ground, if a mouse carries it along and buries it in the ground, that acorn will have a lot of energy from the mother. And as soon as it starts germinating, that energy pours from this big old meaty cotyledon into the root, forces the root down into the soil and just pours nutrients into them, gets them out of the cotyledon. However, those cotyledons, these big, fleshy seedling leaves basically, are also what's tasty to squirrels, what's tasty to blue jays, what's tasty to moth larvae, to weevils. Those cotyledons then play a dual role. They feed the baby plants, but they also entice seed predators and seed dispersers, especially the jay squirrels, who are the primary seed dispersers for oaks. If those cotyledons weren't there to entice the squirrels and the jays to take the acorns and cache them, to hide them for later, the seeds wouldn't disperse.
Do you think, if you're going to want to plant oak trees, would it be prudent to, plant X number of acorns and then grind up a whole bunch of other acorns and use it as fertilizer in the same area? Do you think that would help growth?
I suspect not, because what the mother tree has also done, she's infused this acorn with tannic acid, right? So I think the tannic acid wouldn't do that much for the soil. But you know what might help is grinding up the leaves, because the leaves are going to carry with them fungi and nutrients and also keep moisture in the soil. So I do think that mulching up the dried leaves would help, I would imagine.
Okay. All right. So the acorn, again, starts growing. It, you said it attracts blue jays, and what are these, the creatures that it attracts? What are their jobs? To eat the weevils or keep the predators away from the newly growing cotyledon, or what?
You might imagine they don't. They're absolutely out there. The squirrel is out there to eat the acorn. The blue jay is out there to eat the acorn. And what the tree does is, by suffusing these cotyledons with tannic acid, they're making the acorns suboptimal food for these predators, right? So if a squirrel just eats acorns, it'll lose weight. If a blue jay just eats acorn, or an acorn woodpecker just eats acorns, it'll lose weight, because it's not a great food source for them alone. So they make it so it's the tree makes kind of an imperfect source. The second thing it does is the tree will mast. Masting is the process of making huge abundances of seeds on irregular in a whole population. So if you live in the Chicago area, you may notice that last year we had a huge mass of bur oak acorns and eastern white oak. It's Quercus macrocarpa and Quercus alba. Acorns were everywhere. And we're still seeing white oak seedlings out in the forest. What happens is, when there's so many acorns produced, the jays and the squirrels can't possibly eat them all. And so they end up caching more, hiding more than they ever come back. So as a consequence, the acorn, the squirrels are not out there aiming to do the oaks any good. But because they're such effective hiders of acorns, they inadvertently do good. They are the ones, the squirrels and the blue jays are the ones that are really gardening the oaks, moving them around the landscape.
How do oaks grow naturally? What kind of creature will take, X number of acorns far enough away that they have a chance to grow away from the main trees and not compete for resources?
Mainly it's blue jays and squirrels, or other jays and squirrels. If you look at the distribution of oaks worldwide and then overlay on that a map of the distribution of jays, it almost exactly matches. Jays have the capacity to move acorns hundreds of meters or even kilometers at a clip. Most of their dispersals go on the order of hundreds of meters away. So you get blue jays up in a tree. They'll take an acorn. They'll jam it down into their crop. They'll take another acorn. They'll jam it down there. They'll fit a few more in, and they'll put one at the end of their bill, and they'll fly off 100, 200, 300 meters away, in some cases a couple of kilometers, down on the ground. Then they'll disgorge all these acorns, spit them out, and they'll plant them. They'll hide them in the ground one by one. This is scatter hoarding. This is the process of moving a few acorns or a few nuts at a time out to different areas. Squirrels do exactly the same thing. Watch the squirrels as they are. It's a little bit late to be seeing it for this year because they've mostly hidden all the acorns that they're going to. But next year, when the acorns are dropping off the trees, watch the squirrels grab them. They'll take the acorns. They'll move them to an area in the forest where they're choosing to hide them. And they'll pound the acorns in using their incisors as little hammers. So you'll see them sort of jackhammer the acorns into the ground, typically point first. Jays do the same thing. In so doing, the jays and the squirrels are moving the acorns to places where they are less likely to be devoured by weevils, less likely to be devoured by mice, and where their moisture level will stay high enough that they're likely to germinate if they don't get picked back up by those jays and the squirrels. The squirrels actually have an amazing memory. They can locate themselves on the landscape by triangulating off of big trees, boulders that are out on the landscape, and finding themselves in space and saying, okay, here's where I buried an acorn, and they'll go and they'll dig it right back up. I once watched a squirrel in snow that was 2 feet deep, far too deep that it could have smelled its acorns through there, almost swimming through the snow, just like front crawling through the snow, stopping abruptly, tunneling straight down 2 feet and coming out with an acorn. The only way it could have done this is by visual, as far as I can tell, is by visually recognizing its surroundings. And people have done experiments where they've moved landmarks out on the ground, moved a big tree, and the squirrels get confused because they've actually used those big trees to locate themselves in space. So yeah, when you ask who's planting these acorns, it is the jays and the squirrels, but they're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. They're doing it because they mean to come back and eat those acorns. They just don't get around to all of them.
Are there other acorns that for a whole season will be put into a burrow or sit somewhere and then they get planted? Or do they always seem to get planted pretty quickly after they're taken, fallen?
Yep. That's a great question. So there's variation in between the two major oak groups that we find in North America. We find mainly in North America, most of our species are in the red oak group or in the white oak group. You recognize the red oak group by the fact that they're one of the main things you recognize them by is the fact that their leaves have little bristles at the tips of the lobes, whereas the white oaks don't. One of the other big differences between the red oaks and the white oaks is that the red oaks, for the most part, take a full year to go from flowering to acorn production, actually a year plus a few months. And then once their acorns fall, they don't germinate until the next spring. Whereas in the white oak group, white oaks will go from flower to acorn in the course of just one season. And when they fall to the ground, many of the white oaks, not all, but many of them germinate right away. Now, what this means, squirrels have figured this out. And so squirrels will tend to cache or hide the red oak acorns more than the white oak acorns. And the reason is that the red oak acorns will tend to not germinate until next spring, meaning that they won't pour all their nutrients into the root, getting those nutrients away from the squirrels. Because most of the white oaks are likely to germinate in the fall, squirrels are likelier to eat the white oak acorns right away. Now, if they have to cache the white oak acorns, raised squirrels will often nip off the growing tip off of the end of the acorn so that that acorn can't germinate. It's a little trick that they play. So when you ask, are most acorns destined for a cache or destined for a squirrel's or jay's belly? It depends on the acorn and it depends on the context. If you have red oaks and white oaks growing together, the squirrels get pretty good at figuring out, cache the red oak acorns, eat the white oak acorns for the most part.
Can you tell if you have a forest of oaks, which direction the forest will move in and spread over its time by the action of the squirrels and the jays?
There have been studies where they've traced the movement of forests, and they can trace the oak sort of progression, moving in some cases 10 to 20 meters over the course of a single generation. In other cases, hundreds of meters over the course of a generation. And yet, depending site by site, people have done these studies. I don't know whether there's any generality. I think it depends from site to site.
So what is your research trying to figure out about this whole dynamic?
So what my research is focused on is, one, understanding what species there are in the world. We cannot conserve tree species if we don't know what those species are. And in Mexico, for instance, where we do a lot of work, there's an estimated 150, 160 oak species, but we don't know where one species leaves off and the other one begins. So it's that business of understanding what the species are in the world. A second focus of our work is understanding what genes are moving between species and how that gene flow may help species respond to future difficulties like climate change. Oaks readily hybridize. So you get two species that are closely related. They can swap genes. They can pollinate one another. And then those genes, by back crossing from the hybrid back to one of the parent species, can move from species to species. We know that in some cases, those genes actually will help species survive as climates change, as they migrate into new regions. As we study the taxonomy of species and their evolutionary relationships, we're also asking how that gene flow between species may help oaks respond to climate change.
What happens when you have two different kinds of oaks that are adjacent to each other? How do they tend to interact?
If you look across North America, what you find is that very often, if you look at a plot, right, and there's multiple species in there, very often what you find is at least one white oak species and at least one red oak species. And this is true from the West Coast all the way to the east and down into Mexico as well. It turns out that as oaks have diversified, the white oaks are one lineage of oaks, think of them as one large family. The red oaks are another lineage, another large family of species. And they've all evolved together in North America, in Mexico. As they've done so, the white oaks and the red oaks have filled much of the same kinds of habitats. So the red oaks and the white oaks tend to share space pretty well together. So you ask, how do they interact? One of the things we know is that red oaks and white oaks tend to occupy similar habitats on average across their range. Another thing we know is that closely related species can often form, and members of the same species can often form root grafts, so that their roots will grow together, and very often they will graft with one another. And so you find nutrients and diseases literally passing from oak to oak via the root grafts.
Well, if you have a root graft, though, wouldn't you have a slightly better chance of avoiding disease? If you have a red and a white, they graft. I would think that they would, be able to both fight off the, any invaders more effectively because they have a larger, set of genes that they can exchange and work with.
So root grafting doesn't mean that they're exchanging genes, though. The root grafts, and I don't know that white oaks and red oaks can graft with one another. I believe that they don't, but I do believe that different species of red oaks or different species of white oaks, if they're closely enough related, can form root grafts. Gene flow generally happens by way of pollen moving from one species to another. But the root grafts allow nutrients and water to pass between, and as well as disease organisms to pass between trees. So for instance, there was a really cool experiment done in the UW-Madison Arboretum at one point where they had a whole mess of black oaks on a knoll, and for restoration purposes, they wanted to be able to get a fire through there. But the black oaks were so dense that they couldn't get a fire through there. So the ecologist at the time, Virginia Klein, said, let's take black oak wilt that's already occurring on this hillside and we'll inoculate some of these baby trees. But she didn't want that oak wilt to spread around to the adjacent forest, even though it was coming from the adjacent forest. So they took a plow and they plowed all around the knoll, breaking the root grafts between the black oaks that were on this knoll, this is called the West Grady Knoll, and the adjacent forest. As they went through there, they could actually hear the black oak roots snapping. So they go all the way around this knoll, they snap off all those root grafts, and then they inoculated hundreds of trees with black oak wilt from the local population, and they watched those trees die on the knoll. So they killed off all these baby trees, letting the prairie underneath come up. And what they watched is that the black oak wilt would pass along from tree to tree via the root grafts until it got to where they had cut all the way, trenched all the way around that knoll, and the black oak wilt didn't pass to the adjacent trees across the trench. Sort of evidence that this trenching, that severing these oak roots, kept the oak wilt from passing along.
Well, what if you did like a polka dot structure? You deliberately planted an orchard of oaks, and you did, black, white, and red mixture deliberately, like I said, in a polka dot pattern, or a 3-dot pattern, so that you don't have any cluster of any of them. All the adjacents are, well, not all the, but at least some of the adjacents are a different type. Would that be more healthy, you think?
That would certainly tend to reduce the spread of diseases. Absolutely. Yeah. So not so much the trees helping each other out by spreading immunity or something like that. I don't know of any mechanism like that, but in diseases not being able to spread as easily because their close relatives aren't as close by. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if, is anyone studying like optimal orchard structure? Would you do concentric rings of, different types of oak, let's say, or are there other partner plants that go really well with them that would provide a buffer between a given number of oaks and then, the next type?
That's a great question. I don't really know.
Well, I guess, too, if you planted, you could probably trench maybe around X number of oaks to create that kind of a barrier. I don't know if the roots would just go under them. Do the roots have a certain depth? So you could do something like that, perhaps to avoid these problems?
Yeah, that's a really great question. There are folks working on oak rooting architecture, and that probably something like that could be done. I don't know what the impacts would be, though, because at the same time, the trees do depend on their roots to gather water and nutrients.
Yeah, exciting. What is the size and scope of a typical root bundle of an oak tree? Like, how big is it?
Yep. When you look at them, there's sort of a common belief that the roots of a tree extend out to its canopy. In fact, they extend much further. They extend well beyond. So if you would look at a big tree, look at its canopy, you can expect the oak roots will go well beyond that. How far? I don't know, but quite a ways beyond.
Okay. So again, your research, you're trying to figure out what is the application of the research that you're doing? Like where would it be used?
Yeah. When we want to make recommendations for what species we conserve or for how to conserve species, it's absolutely essential that we understand what those species are. And so our work really contributes to conservation plans, to making reasonable plans for how to conserve and what species to conserve.
What will tend to naturally accompany a copse or a group of oaks? What other plants tend to hang out with them?
Depending on where you are, So this last week, I was in the Sierra Madre Occidental in western Mexico, and we found oaks growing with yuccas and with cactuses. In other areas, you may find oaks growing with maples and ironwoods. It really, in some areas, we found oaks growing throughout Mexico, you find oaks growing with pines. So it really depends on where you are in the range of oaks. You go to East Asia, you find oaks growing in broad-leaved evergreen forests, very much unlike what we find in Eastern North America. When you get to California, you find them growing on dry, rocky slopes, depending on the group that you're looking at, or in dense forests. So oaks have been ecologically very successful. And as a consequence, you find them growing in forests, savannas, brushlands of all kinds.
How does the group of oaks differ in terms of its health or production or other factors when it's around pines versus cacti versus, other things?
It just depends on the oak species. I mean, the species, for instance, the species that we find in southern Mexico flourish in cloud forests, and some of those species extend up the eastern mountains, but those same species wouldn't necessarily flourish in the arid Southwest. But when we go to New Mexico and Arizona, we find species like Arizona oak or emery oak growing in very dry, low mountain environments that wouldn't survive in Eastern North America. So I think the question is not so much like which of these species is doing best, but rather which species survive well where. And one of the reasons for the huge diversity of oaks is that they have been able to adapt to environments that range from southern Canada all the way down to Colombia, and from Western Europe all the way to Southeast Asia.
Well, I mean, beyond survival, are there any arrangements of oaks where they are very unusual? They grow in a strange way, or they produce, some unusual variant of acorn, or they're different. Like, what's are there any outliers that you've seen? Any combination of biome and oak type that seems to be very stick out?
You bet. I mean, there's some fascinating trees. There's an individual tree of Palmer's oak, Quercus palmeri, in California that's estimated to be about 13,000 years old. It's forming a thicket, like 25 meters across. It has been surviving there as climates warmed up following glaciation, and it's now, well outside the range of the rest of the species. And it's definitely an outlier. It's performing like no other oaks of its species just because it's outside of its range. There are other oaks. There's two species in the cloud forests of Mexico down into Central America that have enormous acorns, one called Quercus insignis, one called Quercus skinneri. Insignis is a white oak, skinneri is a red oak. These have acorns that are, they're big enough to fill the entire palm of my hand. They're just enormous. There's another oak, Quercus acutissima, that is commonly planted as a street tree that has extremely elongate scales that sort of recoil around the edge of its cap. So there's acorns that there's a huge range of acorns and growth types of oaks.
Okay. Well, very good. Very interesting. We're just about out of time. So where can people find out more about your research and your work and more about oaks in general?
Yeah. So if folks want to go to the Morton Arboretum website, mortonarb.org, they can find out about research being done across all of our labs here at the Morton Arboretum. If people are interested in a general introduction to oak evolution and ecology, I have a book coming out in the middle of December. It's called Oak Origins: From Acorns to Species and the Tree of Life, from University of Chicago Press. We also have an article in Scientific American from 2020 that people can look up. Other great sources of oaks, there's a really excellent book by Doug Tallamy called The Nature of Oaks, if people are interested in the relationship between insects and oaks. And there's a really great book called Oak, Frame of Civilization that really focuses on the relationship between humans and oaks. These are all great resources.
Very good. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.